Greetings and welcome to another episode of Let's Create Something with TrapcodeTAO and After Effects. So today we're gonna create this spiraling stroked tube, and once again I gotta give the shout out to these guys at Grayscale Gorilla. This is what I saw from one of their daily renders. They've got lots of beautiful renders in here, and they mostly work with Cinema 4D, and they have nice products available for Cinema 4D. It's kind of a go-to site for me where I can learn stuff and get some inspiration, and of course the workflow, like traditional 3D workflow and the TrapcodeTAO, is not the same. It differs in many ways, but at the same time there are lots of aspects that you can translate from techniques used to build stuff in 3D software traditionally that you can apply to TrapcodeTAO. So let's look at how I created this, and also we're gonna try to create this with to make it loop, a seamless loop, and to have the less amount of frames possible, to have it first quicker to render and lighter on the file size. So let's start off by creating a new composition, and let's call this spiral tube 2, because I created another one, and let's save this spiral tube 2. So let's create a new solid in there. I'm gonna hit Control Y, and I'm gonna call this one Tau, and I'm gonna fetch my Tau effect here in the effect preset. So I'm gonna write down Tau there and apply this on here, and as we most often do, we're gonna turn off the generated path because we won't use it. We're gonna use a light to create our geometry. So let's hit Control Shift Alt L to create a new light. Now make sure this one is called Tau, all in capital letters, pretty important. And also make sure that the radius is set to something around 100 default value if you don't want to get any bad surprises. And let's click OK. So also its color will determine how it is. So if we make it blue, it's going to be blue. But let's make it white for the moment, just so we can have a neutral color to start with. Alright, so also usually I turn off the cone angle when I work with Tau, because I don't want to see this in my viewport. So next we're going to simply create a spiral with this, and we're going to use expressions. So let's get on in here, and I don't have a go-to place for expressions where I can find anything, well, aside from Dan Ebberts' website. But most of the time what I do right here, I go to Google and just, in this case, I wrote AE expressions spiral, and it gave me this result. I click on here, and this is a nice tutorial. It explains how to create spirals with expressions in After Effects. But I just went down, that's how lazy I am, I just went down here in the comments, and this guy Dane from 4 years ago, he was kind enough to paste this patch of code for us to use. So here he says, or with ZDef. It's self-explanatory. It's going to help us have a spiral, and it's also going to enable us to control it in the Z space. So that's perfect for us. Let's grab this. Let's select this patch of code here from the shrink up to the last line here, and let's copy that, and let's get back in After Effects. I'm going to select our light, and let's hit P. We're going to alt click on the stopwatch here, so we can have this little contextual text box here, and we can simply hit Control V to paste our code. Here we can drag this down here to see our code there, and automatically it'll refresh in our viewport, and that's what we'll see. So first thing we can notice, it's not very centered, because there is our center point, and it doesn't seem that it's going from the center. Here we have this line here. It says centers equal 640 da, da, da. So this seems like he was working on a widescreen resolution. We are working in a square space, and it's 1080 by 1080, so half of that, 540 by 540, it'll be our center point. If you can see that has refreshed, it's now in the center. So next we might want to do something also is to right click on our light object, get into transform and auto orient. So Control Alt O. Let's do that. Control Alt O. Yes, sir. One step less in our workflow. So let's set that to off. So now it's more like the default thing there. It doesn't like this thing. It's facing only one direction. It's not like distorted and all. So yeah, that's great. So let's add a couple of custom controls on there to help us shape this spiral more like we want it. So let's hit Control Shift Alt Y to create a new null, and in this null we can call it TAO settings, and let's make both of these lavender color so we can group them and tell that they are part of the same group. And also we can make this 3D, and we can simply connect our light to that. But as we do this, now our center point will have changed, because now this is at the center. This is at 540. So in relation to this should be now at 0. So let's set the center point back to 0, and now we have our spiral attached to our null. We can move our null if we want to change the position of this spiral as a whole. But remember that you won't be able to keyframe this thing if you would want it to move around, because it's considers it as geometry creation keyframes. It's not the way TAO works. I know it's kind of confusing, but if you want to move this thing as a whole, you have to think of another way to do it. So let's create a couple of custom sliders here. So let's get under effects while we have our TAO settings null selected, and let's get into the expression controls. I'm going to add a slider control. So let's hit U here so we can reveal this. So we have a couple of things here: shrink, time +1, I don't know what is that, radius. So let's get on in here and let's lock that so we can make sure that this panel stays here all the time, whatever if we click another one. So let's call this radius, and let's link this to that. So it's set to 1000 for the moment. Let's keep it the same to start with, and I'm gonna select the 1000 number here, and I'm gonna, once it's selected, I'm gonna use this here and drag it on here to pick whip it to it, and nothing should change, but it means that we can now change our radius from here. So that's pretty neat. Also, we got another value here, and it's called the angle. So that's the amount of time it rotates around to create this. So by default, TAO is always let's hit F3 there so we can have our panel. Let's bring it down here. So TAO uses 10 seconds to generate its geometry. So if we go down to frame 300, this we can add a marker here, and end of GO. So that's when our light stops emitting. So it'll go there. It's gonna go round and round and round, and that's the amount of turns it make is based on this number here that is set to 2000 for the moment. So that's an angle value. We can use another kind of custom controls. So let's select our TAO settings, and we can use an angle control there. So let's set it to 200 now, just to connect it to it, and nothing should change. So I'm going to select the 200 number here, drag this onto here, and nothing should change. But if we change this now, it changes the amount of rotation it makes. So let's see this as in terms of full revolution. So I'm going to save that. So if this has no rotation, it doesn't rotate at all. One full revolution, it'll make that. And let's add more geometry, because now I feel that it's all going triangly because there's too few segments. So if we increase this amount of segments here, we're gonna get back our circular kind of shape. Let's keep it to this amount, and so let's see what we get if we have 2 revolutions, something like that. So let's start with 1. So that's kind of 360 degree. All right, so that's pretty good. And we also have this z time multiplied by time. So what happens here? If we look at the z value, it increases very slowly as we move through time because it's connected to the time value. That's okay. It's almost like we want it. We don't want it to stay at 0. We want it to increase over time, but we want a little bit more control on that. So we're gonna add ourselves a custom multiplier for that. So let's duplicate our radius setting here, and let's bring it down there, and let's call this z depth, and let's start with setting it to 0, so that doesn't change anything. So no, to 1, so it at least something. And let's simply add a multiply after the z equals time multiplied by time multiplied by this value here. So let's grab our pick whip and connect it to that. So by default nothing should change because it was already doing it one time, but now if we multiply it by 2, and if we drag this, it's gonna create our spiral is gonna as it gets drawn, it's gonna move towards the depth. So let me just create a camera here, Control Alt Shift C, and I'm gonna use the default 50 millimeters. Hit OK, and Control Alt Shift Y to create a new null. I'm gonna make this one pink, call it Dolly, make it 3D, and connect my camera to it, so we have something right at the center that we can turn around. So this is what's happening with our spiral now. We don't want that much space in between, so we can reduce that until we're satisfied with what we're getting. So something like that maybe. And let's get this back to 0. And one thing I've noticed also is it's easier to control 360 degree based stuff if we have 12 as a duration if no keyframe, because 12 it's, well, not that it matters that much, but it's easier for my brain to understand because 12 seconds is 360 frames, so it matches the amount of degrees. So when I do circular stuff, I use 12 seconds for time basis instead of 10. So we can move this up to here, but it's not, that's not totally necessary. It just might help you a little bit. Next, let's get back in our TAO settings, and let's try to have 1.5, so 1 plus 180, and well, let's put it back to 1 for a moment, and let's get back to our TAO, and let's increase. First, let's turn off the chamfer. Let's increase the sides so we have something that's more of a kind of a spiral there, and we can uncheck the break sides, or not, it won't change anything. Let's get under the render section here, and let's get that to smooth instead of flat, so we're gonna have a better result here. And of course we'll have to increase the amount of segments until it gets all smoothed out, so around 680, and also the amount of sides. Now we can uncheck that. I think that, yeah, it should be smooth. If you see here, if this is checked, break sides, we can see our segmentation here, but if I uncheck it, it's gonna smooth it out. So we can reduce this number even. If I have it set to 12, right there, it's nice like that, but if I uncheck that, even if we're as low as 12, it's gonna break it down like that. So that's what we want. It's pretty cool. Excellent. Now we can go back to our settings and once again mess around with that until we get something that's more convenient, so around 2, and but let's keep it to 1, and let me just further show you something else. So that's our spiral. It starts like this and it starts like that. If we take that and we rotate this, we can easily change where it starts. So let me undo. All right, back to here. All right, so now we can perhaps zoom with our camera so we can get full in. Let's get in our settings and let's have this a little bit more. So 1 and 180, or let's try 2 full revolutions. So that's 720 degrees overall. And let's get a little bit closer. And let's get the Z depth more. So we can see what we have if we rotate around it. So depending on how you want it to go deep, simply adjust your Z depth slider here, and so that's pretty cool. We might have to increase the amount of segments once again because we have a pretty long tube here. So let's multiply this by 2. And it should be kind of smooth now. It isn't all that smooth, eh? Let's have less rotation. So I think 1 and 180 was fine. Yeah. And then just get a little bit closer there. Alright. Let's go to the next step. And let's texture this. So a couple of ways we can do it. Let's choose the simplest. So we're going to create a new solid, Control Y, and let's call this text, and let's make this 500 by 500. We don't need it to be bigger than that. Let's hit OK. So now we're going to pre-comp this, so Control Shift C on this layer and leave all attributes. So hit OK. We should have this enclosed in this size, and right on there let's add a ramp, and let's add a colorama, and by default we can get in the output phase here, and let's choose a ramp gray, and let's uncheck the interpolate. So that's our texture. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that. We can add more repetitions via here, and make sure that this numbers stays a full number if you want everything to tile. But let's keep it at not at 0 but at 1, so we have only that. And let's get back in here. So that's our texture. Let's see what happens if we apply that to our tube. So let's come over here under the texture, and for the color texture let's choose our text comp. Oh, it's not exactly as we expected, isn't it? Let's get back in here and let's rotate that 90 degrees so it's horizontal instead of vertical. So let's get back in here and let's hit Control Alt front slash to refresh, and nothing more has happened. So what can we do? Let's increase the texture scale X. So on Y we don't need to mess around with it, but on the X we need a really big value because our texture is just 2 stripes and we want this all striped. Now I don't know what it is with stripes and strokes. I don't know if people from my generation were all brainwashed by the entertainment industry with stroke stuff, but I don't know, it's not as if we had like that many characters based around the idea of strokes or stripes, and if they were like, were they even not even the good guys? Most of them are the bad guys. I mean, this thing looks like a long hamburger helper arm there. But as you can notice, if we bring this amount really high, so the texture scale X, it's going to allow us to repeat it over the length of our thing here. So that's pretty neat. We can multiply this number by 2 and it'll make it twice as small. So that's pretty interesting what we can do here by having this simple texture repeated like that. One other thing that we can do here, if you can notice the aliasing issues here, if we set the texture filter to linear, it should in principle look a little bit better, but in this case it doesn't seem it makes it. Maybe if we add a little bit of that. No. So in this case, let's test something. So let's double the size of that. Let's make it 1080, and let's make sure Control Shift Y to get in this solid settings. Make sure that it's the same size, and let's get back. Let's see if that will help. No, it doesn't. So anyway, that's one way to do it. And if we want to have this whole thing, this whole texture moving around, well, it's pretty easy. Either we do it with this, like we can keyframe that and not the scale but the offset texture on X, and if we move this, like, we can make it loop. But one way that is even easier, because if we would change the texture scale, then we would have to change all this. But if we don't want to worry about it anymore after we keyframed it, let's animate this. So that's easier. Let's get in the input phase and let's add a keyframe. Let's go to frame 90, so 30 seconds. And let's make one full revolution of phase shift. So that's simply, if I hit you here, you can see both my, it's simply gonna do that. It's simply gonna make this move like that. And since everything is seamless on the way it's made, if we test it here, what we'll see is that and I'll have to refresh that because part of the cache memory is still remembering old stuff. So that's interesting. We have 90 frames, we have something. It doesn't make like a 360 revolution all this thing to loop. It just, we just need this texture to move until this black spot takes the place of the black spot next to it. So it can be very slow and at the same time only a few keyframes. So that's interesting. It's fun. That's now this place here, like this middle point here, it's getting pretty. If we want to lose this thing in the distance here, we can easily come to the visibility here and mess around with the range. First, let's see how far this goes. So let's set that to 4,000 and we still see it all, so it doesn't go as far as 4,000. Oh no, let's hit Control Shift H so we don't see the layer control. So as we arrive here around this, we're starting to cut it. So that's one thing that if you don't want it to go further than that, we can simply set that to that, and then we know that this is gonna stop at this point. So that's one way to do it. And we can also add some fog to that. So let's take this number here and bring it to the fog end, and let's bring our fog start to 888. So that's where it starts and that's where it ends. So we might need to drag this to get this all. So we have some kind of white light at the end of the tunnel. Usually people, that's what they see at the end of a tunnel, a bright white light. I don't know, I haven't been there yet. Yeah, that's one way that we can do that. And let's add some. If I look at this thing, it's kind of all wobbly and all. So let's add that to it in a manner in which we can animate it with the offset. So let's see how we can do that. First, let's add some wiggling initially. We can get in our TAO settings here, and we're gonna add 2 more controls. So let's duplicate our Z depth here, and we're gonna call this frec, and we're gonna call this amp, because we're gonna mess with a wiggle here. So let's set both at 0 to start, and let's get on our TAO light here, and let's hit quickly twice on A, so we reveal the properties, and we're gonna use the radius here. Alright, so on the radius we want it to wiggle, but we want a wiggle that loops. So once again we're gonna get to Dan Ebbert loop. So we're gonna go get this patch of code here on motionscript.com, and this will allow us to have a wiggle, a looping wiggle. So we're gonna add this looping wiggle to our radius property here. So let's simply paste that, and by default its loop time is set to 3. Let's see what we'll use. So the frequency, we want to connect that to that, and the amplitude, we want to connect that to that. And let's see, we're gonna also add in a custom control for this, so let's do that. And we cannot set it at 0, so let's set it at 3. Alright, so still moving around. Our geometry is not moving, it's only the texture that is creeping on it. Alright, so let's increase the frequency. Let's set that to 1, and let's increase the amplitude. So nothing happens because it has been turned off. Alright, so let's increase the amplitude drastically so we can notice some changes in here. Can we see some changes? Let's increase the frequency. Okay. So it doesn't seem like it's affecting it. Let's verify. Let's get in our TAO. And I thought we did this, but let's check the size from radius. And as soon as we do that, it's gonna screw everything up because we got super big values here. So the frequency, let's set that to 1, and the amplitude, let's set that to 20. Not a big amount. So as I increase this now, you can see that it's getting our geometry to be distorted. Now the frequency, the higher this is, the smaller the bumps will be over the size of this. So if I set that to 3 instead of 1, there you'll see it's gonna be more distortion. But I don't want that much. I don't want it to be that intense, so let's set this back down to 25. And also it's gonna loop along this. So we don't want, like, we want to have something that loops around, because or else when we'll offset it, then we'll have to offset what's like over the duration of all this. But we're gonna simply trick it. We're gonna have the same distortion a few times over the course of our thing. I don't know if that's something that is easy to understand, but let's try to figure this out. So let's increase the frequency once more to 6, and let's decrease the amplitude to 15, and let's so that's what we're starting to get. So around 12 maybe. So we're trying to get this kind of a nice pattern here. So So that's nice settings. We can also go, I'm jumping from one subject to the other, I know, I'm sorry, but let's, it's making me think about this. Let's increase the ambient occlusion so we can just make it more of this contact shadow in between each step of our tube here. So if I increase this intensity here, you'll see it appear, and we can also increase its radius so it's a little bit bigger. So that's simply going to make it a little bit nicer for the contact spots. We're going to get ourselves a little bit of a shadow there. Alright, so is this wobbling gonna be animated? No. Our texture is gonna spin around it, but it's simply not gonna be moving. It's kind of mesmerizing, but and looping, but our wobbling it's still. So we want to move that along our path. So since we have it 12 seconds and our loop time for this wiggle is 3, that means that it's exactly that our wiggling pattern gets repeated 4 times over the course of our tube, of our spiraling tube, if that's something that you can understand without any confusion. So let's get in the offset here, and let's start with that. So we're gonna go at frame 0. We're gonna make a keyframe, and we're gonna go at our last frame for the loop, and let's make this at 100. And let's test it. I'm gonna put that to quarter just so we can get faster results. So if I test this, of course it's gonna work, and I didn't check the loop offset option, but you know it's gonna go like crazy fast because it moves all the course of our duration of the, but think about the math here. We're going from 0 to 100, so we're going from the first to the last, but our loop time for the wiggle is 3, so we can divide that by 4 because 3 is there 4 times in 12. So let's divide that by 4, and that should stay the same. So let's make a keyframe here. Let's make a marker, shift 3 and shift 3 on frame 0, so we can quickly go from one to the other. So that doesn't quite work here. So it's not 25, it's not the value exactly. What our value here? Because it might be if we check loop offset here. So if we go to frame 1 and we go to frame 3, this should potentially work. Let's test it out. But it's still gotta go pretty fast around here. And the only way to make it less fast would be to have less frequency in our wiggling, but we need this frequency because that's what makes it visually the way we want it to be. So let's uncheck the loop offset, and this is how we're gonna go for this. So little magic trick for this to loop, and the only thing that we have to worry about. So let's get over here, and we can offset, we can put any number that we want here to decide for the speed. So if I put 5, then I'm happy with this kind of speed as it moves along. And if I wanted to loop, what we've got to do simply is that make sure that this number here on the last frame here, so 5, let's grab it, let's get in our settings, and let's make it a little bit more frequent because we can put any number here, doesn't matter. So in the wiggle loop duration here, let's also put 5, the same number that we have here. And the only thing that we're gonna add here is right in the radius code we pasted here under the loop time, the third line of code here. on the end here we're gonna divide all that by 10. So let's add a divider by 10, and also I'm gonna bring this back from 12 to 10, also to make sure that it's the default value here doesn't need to be 12. So let's bring this back to 10. So now if I go to frame 1 and to frame 3, it's gonna be the same frame, but in between there's gonna be the interpolation of our wiggling. Magic! So in a way we can, without knowing what's happening under the hood, we can have the certainty that our wiggle motion is gonna loop pretty fine with this technique. So put any number here on the second offset. Make sure that it's not let's get back to the offset tab here. So make sure that loop offset is actually not checked, because this is not going to work if we check it. Yes, it is, but anyway, it doesn't need to be checked. Simply leave it off, and the first frame at 0 for this value, and the second frame you can put anything. Usually that's the best way to nail down the correct speed we want to have, and still use only 90 frames and have it loop. So if I want to half the speed of that, simply put 2.5 on the offset here, and then make sure that here on the wiggle loop duration it's also set to 2.5, and it shouldn't be any problems. It should loop pretty fine. So yeah, that's one nice way that we can add some kind of displacement, and we don't even have the fractal displacement enabled, so we could even add more kind of motion to this, adding the displacement, the fractal displacement over to that. So let's make it play out until the end, just to see if it loops correctly. Yeah, quite mesmerizing. So now that's quite the principle here. Let's just make it a little bit angled on the X here, so we can look at our thing going down from this kind of an angle. And it's kind of easy to add some reflection to this. Right now it's not going to be another tutorial where we spend too much time on the looks, but keep in mind that we can always go in the built-in environment and add some dark industrial reflection on here. And this one is pretty dark, so we might want to increase the diffuse strength pretty high and decrease the reflection strength to get something like this, depending on what you want. And or you can increase this and then increase the Fresnel. So if I put it to 100, it's gonna disappear all the way. To 90, you're not gonna see it very much. So 77, just gonna have a hint of it. Now we can raise it back in here. So just messing around with that. So that's pretty cool, if you ask me. Let's tone this down. And let's see what others... this is too strong now. Let's tone it down. So other looks that we can get from different... from different environments. And right now it would be really easy, for example, if we want to change the texture and we want to have colored stroke, for example. So if we simply get in here under in the colorama, in the output cycle, let's select another one that doesn't have too many. So RGB has 3. Yeah, let's say we would want this RGB thing now. Well, we just change that, and that'll simply affect it. And our loop is gonna be kept intact. So if we want the strokes wider, we don't need to change anything else. Then under the texture here, we can divide this amount by 2. Now it should make our strokes twice as big, so that's quite easy to change afterwards. So also we could add some fractal displacement on top of that to get yet even more wiggling in there. So simply by increasing the amplitude here and the frequency, we could get even more distortion, and we can even animate that. So let's see, the offset X, the offset Z, what would be the one that we, let's start with the offset X. So not alt click, but I'm gonna simply keyframe something here. So on frame 0 I'm gonna click on the stopwatch to add a keyframe, and I'm gonna go to frame 90, and I'm gonna increase that sufficiently for it to loop, because if we depending on the values we put here, it might not work if it's not high enough. So let's try that, and then we open up the if we need, we can open up the individual amps and frecs. If we have sometimes stuff that warps weirdly, sometimes that's because there's an angle that we just don't want it to be displaced here. So in this case, perhaps we don't need that much on the Z, and what does on the Y does. So yeah, maybe we just want on the X a little bit. So let's use that, and let's open up the seamless loop here, and since we've keyframed it like that, we don't need to worry about nothing else and clicking on this while we're here, and that's gonna input a value here, and it should have it animate and loop. So that's pretty fun, pretty nice way to get some even more action going on there. And also, if for example, if I want this thing to be going instead towards white and going towards dark, we can change the fog color here, so that's also easy for us to apply a new look by doing that. So pretty neat. Let's get another colorization here. So let's try to fire. Let's see what would that bring us. What would that, oh, so that's something else. So let's put back the RGB, but let's see if there's one with 4. Is there one with 4 by default? I'd like to get one with 4 equally placed. 5 is okay. So let's get some nice colors here. I don't know why, but orange and blue, well, I know why, mathematics in general, but let's try that. And let's refresh. strokes are a little bit thinner because we have more in our texture, then we can simply come here and have this divided by 2 once again, depending on what we're trying to achieve here. And on top of that, we're going to hit Control-Alt-Y just to create a new adjustment layer, so we can pop everything out by adding a curves effect. So we're not using any real light objects to light this up, simply smart image based lighting. So that's what we can come up with. And sometimes let's get this back to full. Sometimes we have some kind of issues with the ambient occlusion just on the crease here. It seems that the line gets a little brighter. There's a little bright line here. We can kind of tone this down by setting it to super sample instead of multi-sample. So let's try 9x here. And the problem with this is that if we have edges, something on the edges, it might look it might get you some fringes on the outside edges, but since we don't see any of our outside edges, let me just zoom back so I can show you. So no, let's not zoom back. So that's, yeah, that's how I would simply use that, and maybe like the ambient occlusion might be too strong now, so we can just increase the scale a bit, maybe. And also we can mix our SIBL with some true lighting. So let's enable the include TAO Lumi light here, not the TAO lights, because we don't want to use our light that creates the geometry. We want to add a new one. So Control Shift Alt L, and let's have this as a point, and let's call it TAO Lumi, all caps. Hit OK, and that should allow us to get more rich lighting. This light, we can control its radius, and where is it right now? So right there it is. Let's bring it at 0 on the z-axis, so it's coming from downwards. And sometimes there is some weird stuff happening as I move this object that is totally unrelated with the geometry, but I don't know if you can see here, some parts are kind of disappearing and reappearing. That shouldn't be a problem. You can also shade this, so if we want like to have some kind of a blue light that would come on this, it's kind of not pretty hard to do it like that. So that's it. That's what I wanted to show you today. It's kind of a mix between my endless staircase tutorial and the candy ring blob. I guess you can watch those tutorials as well if you want to know more, and I've got plenty more, so you can follow me. And if you ever make something with TrapcodeTAO or with any other plugins, and based on what you learned in one of my tutorials, or just if you make anything, you can always tweet that to me or just post it on where I can see it, and there are good chances that I tweet it back and help you out, making your stuff be seen by more people. So keep that in mind, and as always, thank you very much for watching.